There's a stillness that comes after loss, a quiet so deep it hums in your bones. After my mother died, the house didn't feel like ours anymore. It became an echo, a place where sound used to live. The radio stayed off, the laughter that once spilled from the kitchen vanished, and every clock tick felt too loud. My father used to fill every corner of this home. His voice, his footsteps, his presence. He was steady, certain, a man who knew how to fix anything. But when she was gone, something in him broke that no one could repair. First, I thought grief would bring us closer. I imagined we'd talk, share stories, hold on to her memory together. But instead, he slipped away quietly. Not physically. He was still here, moving through the rooms, sitting at the table, drinking his tea, but it wasn't really him. His eyes never stayed on me for long. His words became few and soft, as if every one of them cost him something to say. He'd sit at the dining table long after dinner, staring into the space where she used to sit. Sometimes he'd reach across the table, almost like he expected her hand to still be there. When he realized it wasn't, he'd pull back, rub his temples, and pretend he was fine. Days blurred into weeks. I tried to fill the silence, cooking, cleaning, humming songs she used to love, but it never changed anything. The air still felt heavy. When I asked if he wanted to join me for a walk, he'd nod without moving. When I turned on the TV, he'd get up and leave the room. I didn't blame him. Not really. Losing her had gutted both of us, but in different ways. I tried to carry on by staying busy. He carried on by disappearing inside himself. One evening, I found him in the living room staring at an old photograph of her. His thumb brushed her face through the glass. "She always hated this picture," I said softly, trying to sound casual. Said it made her look too serious. He didn't look up. "She was serious," he murmured. "She took care of everything." There was nothing I could say to that. 'Cause she had. I stood there for a long moment before leaving him with his memories. That became our pattern. Me trying to step in, him gently keeping the distance. Winter turned to spring, but inside the house, the seasons never changed. The same quiet, the same pale light through the windows. I began to notice small things about him. The way he lingered at the sink, the way he paused before opening her closet, the slight tremor in his hand when he touched her favorite mug. Sometimes I'd hear him in the early mornings, whispering her name under his breath, as though he was afraid to say it out loud. I missed the version of him that used to tease me for sleeping late, who laughed too loud when my mother rolled her eyes at his jokes. Now, when I spoke, he listened, but it felt like he was listening from far away, from a place where I couldn't reach him. I remember the night it all cracked open. Rain was tapping against the window, soft but steady, a rhythm that made the house feel alive again. I couldn't sleep. The air felt too heavy, the bed too cold. I went downstairs to make tea, hoping the warmth would calm my restlessness. The kitchen light was already on. My father stood by the counter, shoulders hunched, hands gripping the edge like he needed something to hold him upright. The sight stopped me. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. Not in his face exactly, but in his posture, as if grief had added years to his spine. "You couldn't sleep either?" I asked quietly. He turned, startled, then shook his head. "It's the rain," he said. "I keep hearing her voice in it." I hesitated. "I know. It sounds like she's still walking around upstairs." A tired smile flickered across his face, there and gone again. I reached for 2 cups, poured the tea carefully, my hands trembling slightly. When I passed one to him, our fingers brushed. It was just a second, but I felt it, the fragility, the loneliness sitting between us. He cupped the tea, eyes fixed on the rising steam. "I miss her voice," he said. "That was always the thing that kept me steady. Even when I was angry or lost, she'd say one word, and I'd remember who I was." My throat tightened. "You're still that person," I said, unsure if I believed it or just needed to. He looked up then, really looked. And for the first time in months I saw him. Not the hollow version of my father, but the man underneath the grief. "You've grown stronger," he said quietly. "She'd be proud." "So would you," I replied before I could stop myself. Something softened in his eyes, something that looked like gratitude and pain tangled together. We stood side by side, sipping tea, listening to the rain. For once, the silence didn't feel empty, felt shared. When I went back to my room that night, the warmth of that small moment lingered like a faint light in a dark place. After that, something shifted between us, barely noticeable at first but real. He started joining me in the kitchen again. Sometimes he'd ask about my day or mention a recipe she used to make. We even laughed once when I accidentally burned the toast. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me what his laughter sounded like. He began spending time outside again, tending to the garden she loved, trimming the roses that had overgrown since she left. Watching him there, the sunlight catching on his hair, I felt an ache I couldn't quite name, something between sadness and relief. One afternoon, I found him repairing an old photo frame that had cracked along one edge. "Why not just get a new one?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Because she picked this one. Some things aren't meant to be replaced." I stood beside him as he worked, our hands brushing occasionally when we reached for the same nail. It felt strange, not uncomfortable but fragile, as if the whole moment could shatter if either of us spoke too loudly. When he was done, he wiped his hands on a cloth and looked at me for a long time. "I wasn't a good father these past months," he said quietly. "I couldn't look at you without seeing her." "I know," I said. "I thought maybe that's why you stayed so quiet." He sighed. "It wasn't your fault. You reminded me of everything I lost. But lately, you remind me of why I need to keep going." The words hit me harder than I expected. For months, I'd been trying to bring him back without realizing he'd been trying to find his way too. From then on, small routines became our language. We cooked together on Sundays. He started humming again while washing dishes. When we sat on the porch in the evenings, he'd point at the horizon and tell me stories about when he met her. How she'd laughed at his terrible dancing, how she'd scolded him for overcooking rice on their first dinner together. Those stories didn't hurt as much anymore. They sounded like life returning. One evening the power went out. The house was swallowed by darkness except for the candles flickering on the table. I expected him to go quiet again, but he didn't. He poured wine into 2 glasses, handed me one, and smiled. "She would have loved this," he said. "She'd say we're being dramatic," I teased. He chuckled, the sound warm, familiar. "Maybe. But she'd still sit here just to watch the rain." The moment felt simple, but it carried something sacred. After dinner, as I gathered the plates, he reached across the table and stopped me with a gentle touch. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying. For letting me remember what it feels like to be alive." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. His words carried the kind of sincerity that didn't need an answer. Later that night, I found him asleep on the couch, a book resting on his chest. I draped a blanket over him. As I turned to leave, he opened his eyes. "I didn't mean to wake you," I whispered. He smiled softly. "Maybe I was waiting for you." I sat beside him in the quiet. The rain had slowed outside. There was no pain in the silence anymore, only peace. He reached out, took my hand and held it loosely, not like someone grasping for what's gone, but like someone finally learning how to hold on again. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized grief doesn't end the way people say it does. Doesn't fade. It just changes shape. From pain into memory. From memory into something you carry quietly, like a scar that no longer hurts but still reminds you where you've been. When my mother died, I thought I'd lost everything. Her laughter, her presence, the balance she gave us. But I see now, I didn't just lose her. I lost the version of my father who only knew how to live when she was there. And yet, in all the silence, through all the cracks, I found another version of him. Gentler, more human, learning how to love what's left instead of what's gone. Love doesn't always roar back into life. Sometimes it returns in whispers. A shared cup of tea, a faint smile across candlelight, a hand resting over yours just long enough to say, "I'm still here." Because grief doesn't just take. Sometimes if you're patient enough, it gives something back. something softer, something still alive.